if you don't mind. You can consent to that, please. If you prefer to keep your video blank, that's fine. It certainly gives you a chance to catch up if you do miss anything. Well, let's begin again with a piece of scripture first of all, and then a brief prayer. A wee section, a wee section from Mark, a familiar one, Mark chapter 10, verses 13 to 15. It'll be familiar to you. People were bringing little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them. But the disciples rebuked them. When Jesus saw this, he was indignant. He said to them, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Truly, I tell you, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it." It always annoys me when I come across churches who don't welcome children, who just see them as a problem. But I love the attitude of Jesus there. Let the little children come to me. Don't hinder them. Let's pause for a moment in prayer. Father God, be with us and guide us. Help us to learn how we can be like Jesus in understanding children, in giving a welcome to young people, in nurturing them. Because of the tasks that each of us work at, the roles we have, children and young people are a priority for us. Help us to be as effective as possible in what we do with them. Help us to model Christ and help us to share Jesus in everything we do. In your name, Lord. Amen. I'm going to bring up the screen share and we'll have a look at the PowerPoint for today. Just before I start that, can I ask, are you all registered yet? Are you all enrolled? Do you have university emails? Is this still a problem?
So I'm enrolled, but I can't access Aula yet, but they're thinking it's maybe a lag between enrolling and then being able to access that.
All right.
I'm the same, Steve.
Right. What about you, Lee?
No, I got the email this morning. I've not had a chance to enroll yet. I'll do it right after this, and then I'll save it over after that.
Okay.
I tried again, but I encountered a new error further into the process. So I've not managed to enroll yet, but I've emailed them to try and sort it.
Right.
So
wonderful. I'm sorry you've had such a poor experience of beginning at the university. Christina's sitting there quite smug because you've seen it all.
Yeah, but I'm not enrolled yet. Because when I tried to enroll, it came up with my past modules rather than this one. So I had to email them and email Ellie. So I'm not quite sure what's happening at the moment.
Right. I know Lena is on the case and is trying to sort some of these teething issues. Okay, what I'll do is I will just start off then with these first few slides. Aula access is really something that you should have. It's vital to carrying out the course, so I hope we can get this sorted quite quickly for you. Let me show you Aula first. That might be best. That might be the most useful thing, and then you know what it is you're looking for. Okay, when you do finally get access to Aula, it should look something like this. Can you see that on your screen okay? It has the module identifier code up at the top and time for reflection 2023-24 term 1. There are 2 basic sections. You either click on community, and there's really nothing there at the moment, or journey. And journey is where you find all the useful stuff that we actually use each week. So there's a wee introduction to myself, Steve Younger, who. There's some general information for students. And as you go down, what you do is you find each week all the resources that you need. Now, what I'll do is I'll try and send you things week by week until we're all up and running on Aula. It's a bit of a clumsy and clunky way to do it, but at least it keeps you up to date. Each week on Aula is split into 3 sections. So what we're looking at today is concepts of spirituality and spiritual development. We'll look at the whole idea of faith development, and we'll look at some of the key thinkers in that area. So there's the title for each week, and then there are 3 sections: concept and challenge. And that's just a wee short explanation. What is the concept of spiritual development? There's usually a wee video to look at as well. And the one here this week is on the Shinari indicators. If you're in school regularly, you'll recognize the Shinari indicators. Then there's the actual class and the PowerPoint. That's the second section. And there's always a post-class bit as well. And the post-class one this time looks at the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and the things that affect the faith development of children and young people. That is a very quick introduction. And once we're all on Aula, I'll be able to give you a bit more detail on that. So again, on the behalf of the university and the college, my apologies that you're not yet able to see all that. So if I stop that screen share. Welcome, Fiona. Good to see you've joined us.
Thank you. I'm sorry I'm late. I was in a meeting and it ran over.
No problem. These things happen. I was starting with an apology as well to say that I've contracted COVID, tested positive yesterday, so I'm feeling lousy.
Oh,
And if I go off on a wee tangent or forget what I'm doing, just call me back. Fiona, I think it was you that raised a question about the assessments as well.
yes, that's correct.
Right. So I'm going to begin by talking a bit about that. We were just showing the pictures there of Aula and what that should look like when you all do finally get access. But let me talk specifically about the assessment. This is a level 7 module, and it has 2 assessment pieces. So I hope you were expecting this, that you're actually going to have to write an essay and do an assignment.
No, I wasn't.
So here you are, straight in at the deep end. Now, don't panic, because you've got plenty of lead-in time to this. This first one is until 6th of November. And what it is a straightforward essay. Now, I know some people come to this course straight off another degree, or they're used to studying, or they do CPD regularly. And for other people, maybe you've been out of study for quite a long time, and this is really scary. Please don't panic, and we will guide you through this. If you've got any worries, then please get in touch and let me know. This first assessment piece then is due on the 6th of November. It's an essay of 2,000 words, which may sound a lot, but if you're doing a standard 10-point font on a Word document, that's about 2 pages worth. There's guides in the university handbook on how you format it, how you do a bibliography, and so on. So if you're stuck on any of that or you can't find that, let me know. But essentially, your first piece is an essay choice, and it's pretty broad. You get to do 1 of these three possibilities. And they're all relevant to what you're doing in schools. So first one, you could opt for this. What's the role of a school chaplain in a non-denominational Scottish school? Maybe you are already a chaplain. Maybe you had an experience of a chaplain while you were at school. For a lot of people, it was the elderly man with a ring of confidence who came in and did a wee God talk, and everybody switched off. I'm old enough to remember when schools had their own hymn books as well. You were expected to sing, and nobody ever did. It was just embarrassing, and I think it inoculated people against any faith. But what is the role of a school chaplain? Are they simply the one who parachutes in, does a wee God thought, and then back out? What is the role of a school chaplain? Where do they fit in? Second question looks at time for reflection, the time for reflection requirement in schools, and just asks you to think through, how does that differ from values education or character formation? And the third option, where does time for reflection belong in the curriculum for excellence? What does it contribute to the curriculum for excellence? Hopefully you've all got that in an email. I think I sent that with a bibliography for each option as well. Can I say about bibliographies, you don't need to read everything that's there. But if you are doing an essay at level 7, easy way to remember it is the university will look for you to reference at least 7 works, one of which should be an online resource or a journal article. That's a rough guide for how many books do I actually need to quote from, how many do I use. If you see a book on the list, please don't start at page 1 and go all the way through to end. Just scan through and find the bits that are relevant. Any questions about that essay requirement? If something comes up in the next couple of days, just send me a wee email, get in touch, and I'll do my best to answer any queries. And let's go to the second assessment. When you're submitting your essay, the guidelines are in the student handbook, gives all the standards for written work. You can find the bibliography on Aula, but as I say, I've sent that to you. The second assessment piece is much more practical, and that's due on the Friday, 11th December. Now, we'll be a few weeks into the course before you have to do this, but you're each going to take a turn during our class to present a time for reflection event, just like you would in a school setting or in a youth fellowship setting, something like that. And what I'll do is I'll send you a copy of the time for reflection template. And that template includes all the stuff about how you do work in schools. So it's a practical exercise where you get to try your hand at presenting, and we all get to play the part of unruly teenagers or kids acting up. And we have a discussion about your presentation. It's not a criticism. It's about helping each other, making suggestions, praising something that was done really well. And then the actual assessment is, once you've given your presentation to the rest of us, you fill out this template. And that template is the evidence that you would be expected to give to a school. So if you go in to take part in an RME class, or you go in to do an assembly, or you bring the school out to an event in your church building, something like that, you would fill out this template and you give that to the school. Now that's the evidence they use for HMIE inspections. So it's a key skill, and it is, as I say, a very practical thing. Any questions about that one?
You said just do Friday the 11th, but were you also saying that we'll do it in the weeks preceding that, so one person takes a week each, or do we all do it at the same time on the 11th of December?
We'll have one of you do it each week,
Okay, cool.
course of 6 weeks. Yeah.
Fine, thanks.
And what happens is it's kind of a fluid date, so you'll all have the chance to present before 11th December. But you do your presentation to class, and the best thing is if you fill out your template immediately after that and you submit it. But yes, I suppose we could do it that we just had 1 week where you do 6 presentations, everybody has a go at this. But it's less stressful, and I think you get a better impact by doing 1 a week. So I will get in touch with you and I'll offer dates, and it'll be a first come, first served. Some people like to get it over and done with quickly. Others like to see a few others first before they do theirs. Thanks, Lee. Okay, Fiona, does that help? You now know the target dates and you've got a rough idea of the format of what you need to do. Brilliant, thank you. The essay and the template are marked by myself. They then have a second marker within the Baptist College, and then at the end of term they go to a third marker, an external marker, just to verify what we've done. So it's quite a thorough process. Okay, are we ready? Seatbelts on, crash helmets on, knee pads on. Let's delve into this topic of children and faith development, young people and spiritual development. I'm going to take you on a history tour. I hope history is your thing. But let's have a look at the main theories of spiritual development and faith development. And I'm going to start with a name that some of you might recognize. And it fits in with the statements we looked at last week. We looked at some of the official documents on time for reflection. Just a quick reminder. In the All Experiences and Outcomes Guide to Curriculum for Excellence, remember we highlighted the bit that it includes spiritual well-being. I can expect my learning environment to support me to understand and develop my physical, mental, and spiritual well-being and social skills. The problem is most schools are not equipped to do that, and they're actually quite happy to delegate it to you as the professional Christian worker coming into schools. So you need to know, what does spiritual well-being look like? What does spiritual development look like? And that's where we start our history lesson. If you're looking for a definition, by the way, of spiritual development in school, it's in that document we referenced called the RORG, the Report of the Religious Observance Group. And it says that time for reflection is community acts which aim to promote the spiritual development of all members of the school community and express and celebrate the shared values of the school community. Don't know how you react to that, but to me, it's like just a mess of words that's very difficult to pin down and understand. What does that mean? Well, that's what we'll try and answer here. What do spiritual well-being and spiritual development look like? How would you assess them? And are there age-specific experiences and outcomes for spiritual well-being and spiritual development? Well, let me pause the screen share and just actually open that up to you. So take a quick note of those questions. What do spiritual well-being and spiritual development actually look like? How would you assess them? Are there age-specific experiences and outcomes in terms of spiritual development? I don't know if any of you have kids in school, but maybe you remember your own days in school and the horror of being handed your school report to take home to mum and dad. Did you hide yours or did you actually hand it over? But the school report says how well you're doing in terms of literacy, numeracy, language learning, your score on a maths test, and so on. But I've yet to see a report card that comes home with an assessment of spiritual development. There's not a wee line on the report that says when John came in at S1, he was at this level of spirituality. He's leaving now in S6 and he's at this level of spirituality. So let me stop that screen share. And we can have just an open discussion here. What do you think spiritual development looks like in a school context? How would you assess it? How would you know if you're being successful in spiritual development? Not just in a school, but I think with any group of young people.
I don't know how you assess it, because even as adults, you just know spiritual walk. I guess it's hard for me to define how you might talk about a broad spiritual development and then just know about personal Christian faith development, if you can make that distinction. And just knowing it's never a straight line. Nobody's walk is ever just it's kind of up and down, and you might go back in all kinds of ways in your development. So yeah, I've got no idea.
Okay, that's good. Thank you for being brave enough to start us off there.
Yeah.
I think you have highlighted one of the issues. There is no straight line, there's no agreed markers for this.
Mm-hmm.
People can go backwards, it can go up, it can go down.
And even sometimes that I guess that's even sometimes a sign of maturity, of being able to circle back and reassess something that you'd held, to just be able to reevaluate your beliefs and how you see things. That is maturity, being able to take things apart a bit and take a step back and look at things a different way.
Yeah, I think you're right. Sometimes spiritual development and maturity is when you question your beliefs and you pull them apart and then remake them.
Mm.
You're off the hook now, Ian. So let's watch the rest squirm away. Come on, everybody. How about we go at this?
I think going from the school community side of things, I think the school community would assess their spiritual well-being and spiritual development by morals, by how their students conduct themselves, and the choices that they're making. Now, that isn't necessarily what I would assess spiritual well-being and development on, but as coming from the context of school community, how they would be from that kind of standpoint of, well, we've got this many children who adhere to this and follow this school value, so therefore our spiritual development and our spiritual well-being is on the scale of this, because this is how well we're doing.
Yes. Yep, you're describing the issues in a school very well. Did your school ever go into rights respecting awards?
No.
Quite a lot of the schools in Lanarkshire have done the rights respecting awards scheme. And I remember talking to the assessment team coming in when one of my schools was at bronze level. And they said, what are you looking for? How will you know if the school has got these values? And they said, what we do is we'll go into the classrooms, but that's all staged. Teachers are prepared, they've drilled, you've got the best pupils there. What we'll do is we'll walk about the corridors and we'll stop kids at random and say, do you know what the school values are? Can you give me an example of how that would look? So yeah, I think you're right. It's often brought down to a moral assessment and a head knowledge of what the values might be.
Yeah.
But spiritual development is much more than that, isn't it? Yeah.
Indeed.
Okay, anybody want to have another go at this?
So I suppose I'm similarly struggling with it, and I'll probably end up repeating what's already been said by Ian and Fiona in some respects. But I suppose one of the things that jumped out for me was the first word that came. I'm not even sure that I agree with it. I need to think about it. The first word that came up to me was confidence, and being confident in a belief system, and about how do you assess that? You know, like how do you assess where somebody is? You know, because there's obviously, like, I don't know, an exploration phase, and then a development phase, and a confidence phase, and a living out phase. You know, it strikes me as, you know, I agree with Ian, it's not linear, but in some respects, you know, I think we maybe do assess folks' spirituality without really even thinking about it in some ways as well, if you know what I mean.
Mhm.
I don't know if I'm making any sense. I suppose I'm thinking by speaking it out, really.
Yeah, verbal processing works for me too.
Yeah, I think all I really wanted to say was confidence is there somewhere, and and there is a development, isn't there? There's a development of spirituality, and I think that maybe, yeah, it is a good question. How do you assess that?
Yeah, I like your focus on confidence, and actually that does fit within Curriculum for Excellence.
Mhm.
Did mention last week, if you recall, the 4 capacities. And one of those capacities talks about secure values and beliefs. So is a child, is a young person confident in their values and beliefs? So it uses the language of secure rather than confidence, but I think it's talking about the same thing. Well done. Okay.
Lee has made me think of one child in particular that we had in a class, and he would always question things. So every week he would have like a list of questions by the end of the session that he wanted to ask, and some of them like other kids would laugh at and think he was being a bit silly, but I always thought he was the one that really got it on a different level, because everyone else was almost taking what we were saying as like kind of fact that they should just accept that, but he was looking at all the different layers of what we were saying, and some of it was like little kind of practical things, and other things was quite spiritual. And I thought, no, you're the kid that's getting this out of everyone, you know, compared to the rest of them. And they all thought he was a bit funny doing that, which I thought was quite interesting.
Scottish schools had a brief flirtation with philosophy, and I wish they'd carried on with that. That would have been good, but it encouraged children and young people to ask why questions and to keep probing. And I think that curiosity is a mark of spirituality as well. You want to know about more than just the facts. You want to know about the meaning behind them. Okay, thank you for that. Hopefully that's stimulated your thinking, and it's set the background perfectly for the first of our thinkers on spiritual development. So we're going to look at Jean Piaget, Swiss psychologist and psychotherapist. And he's the one who really kind of sets the ball rolling in terms of thinking about moral development, spiritual development, and so on. And he was writing way back in the 1930s. And he wrote a book called The Moral Judgment of the Child. And he called it a theory of cognitive development. And he has 4 stages to it. Now, Jean Piaget assessed thousands of children over the course of his career. And he came up with some very precise figures, which I would dispute, and I'm sure you would too. But very precise figures and age ranges for cognitive development. Now that links into what Cara was saying about curiosity and asking questions. It links into what we've said as well about comprehension, about understanding. So here's the first of Jean Piaget's stages, what he called the sensory motor stage. And that's from birth to 2 years old. Now, you can think about kids that you've seen, children, babies that you've seen, and I think you would identify exactly what Piaget is talking about here. The first stage of development is physical, emotional, senses. So a child takes everything to its mouth, for example. There's a phase where they're testing everything in the mouth. The sensorimotor stage, up to 2 years old, is when a child begins to differentiate itself from objects, recognizes self as an agent of action, so realizes that, for example, sitting in a high chair, if it doesn't like the food, it can push it off the table. An agent of action, begins to act intentionally, realizes, for example, that if you put a rattle there and it starts to shake, it makes a noise. Piaget reckoned that the high point or the end point of this sensorimotor stage is when a child develops what he called object permanence, when they realize that things continue to exist even when you can't see them. And maybe you've played that game or seen parents play that game of hiding behind a towel, and you drop it down and go, boo. You put it up and the child doesn't know where you've gone. There comes that point where that game doesn't work anymore because they know you're there behind the towel. That's that sensorimotor stage. Now, as I say, Piaget reckoned that finished pretty much sharp on your second birthday. I'm not sure you can be that precise. From 2 to 7 years old is what he called the pre-operational stage, where children and young people are learning to use language and to represent objects by images and words. And that's when there's an explosion of language. My wife is retired now, but she was a speech and language therapist. So this was her speciality. But again, you've all been through that phase where parents are anxiously waiting for the first word. And quite often it's mama or dada. And there's this competition goes on between mums and dads to which one's going to be named first. And as my wife points out, they're simply the two easiest sounds to make. And it's purely random which one comes out first. But that realization, you can see it from 2 years onwards, that the child can make a noise and you get a response. And begins to name objects. The thinking, of course, is still very egocentric. Everything's about the child himself. And they can begin to name objects. And you'll see this in nursery schools as well. Kids being taught how to put all the red blocks together, all the square blocks together, and so on, looking for categories. 7 to 11 is what Piaget called the concrete operational stage, where children begin to think logically about objects and events. And he has a very specific classification for this. So he reckoned that to age 6, kids can achieve conservation of number, of mass and weight and so on, classify objects according to several features, put them in a series. And then 11 onwards, Piaget really wasn't interested in anybody beyond 11, curious. But they can think logically about abstract propositions and test hypotheses systematically. They become concerned with the hypothetical, the future, and ideological problems. Karen, I think you said there was one pupil that always questions things for curiosity. What age is he?
That would have been primary 6.
Right, so around about this 10, 11-year age group. So that fits, I suppose, with Piaget, that there are kids who begin to think beyond the sensorimotor, beyond the concrete, beyond the formal, and they're actually beginning to test a hypothesis. They're asking the why. Now, what he does is he says there's a difference then between cognition and comprehension. And I'm going to stop here again and just pose that for you. What do you think cognition is? What is comprehension? How do they differ? And how does that help you work with children and young people? What's cognition? What's comprehension? How do they differ? And how does that help you?
For me, I think the cognition part would be like kind of gathering knowledge and information and stuff and kind of beginning to process it. I think the comprehension is when you properly understand it. think that's what I immediately think of.
That's good. Everybody else is smiling and nodding, so I think you've gone straight to it there. Yeah. Now, in terms of, for example, telling a Bible story in a school lesson, I despair of the story of the Good Samaritan. I wonder how many times kids hear that one, and we then give the meaning that they're supposed to get. So usually we're talking about bullying and so on. Cognition means they would know the story, they could tell the right sequence. Comprehension means they're beginning to understand how it might apply to them. Okay, anybody else want to add in a wee bit? What is cognition? What's comprehension? How do they differ? And what's the relevance of this? Let me pose it a slightly different way. If you were thinking about spiritual development, trying to figure out if you're succeeding in getting across spiritual well-being, what would you look for, cognition or comprehension?
You'd look for comprehension on the basis that you'd be looking for them to ask questions that would suggest they're thinking about how this applies to them in their life and how they apply that there moving forward.
Yeah. And yet I notice a lot of work in churches with children and young people is based on cognition. For example, a memory text learning competition. That to me targets cognition, memory, but not comprehension. I think sometimes we do quizzes. We do quizzes with children, young people. And what we're doing is we think we're checking that they've comprehended the story. What we're doing is a check on their cognition. Can they remember the facts? Can they put them in the right sequence? Can they remember the names that are involved? But I don't think that's yet spiritual development. Anybody want to make a comment on that? Can you see why the difference between cognition and comprehension matters?
I completely I agree with what you're saying about churches, and I guess that's coming from. I guess I feel that a bit keenly in my role as being a children's worker in a church, and trying to. I was just thinking about we've got these kids, and so I'm just talking personally. You know, like we've got this group of kids in church, and we have them for however long we have them, and what is it that we're trying to impart to them?
Yeah.
Do we want them to be able to walk out being able to recite 66 books of the Bible, or do we want them to go out and be able to actually have some basis of a faith and work in relationship with God? And I guess that's very specifically about Christian faith in a church context. But yeah, absolutely, it's the same thing. And even the difference in cognition and comprehension, that you can maybe have the comprehension without the cognition, because even just the memory stuff, I always struggled with that I'm really not good at memorizing things. And so even now as an adult, that there's other people that have the ability to be able to memorize scripture, and they can just say it word for word, that I can do that, but I feel like I've got the comprehension. And that they are very distinct.
They are, thank you. That summarizes it quite well. Schools, churches in particular, seem to spend an awful lot of time getting kids through Sunday club, into youth fellowship and so on. And they look on it as a sign of success if a young person goes away with a whole series of books with little plates in saying so-and-so was able to quote 100 Bible verses. And often what we give them is a Bible as a prize. But does that actually help comprehension? Okay, hopefully that's got you thinking, and that's just starting off with the first of our philosophers, first of our people talking about spiritual development. Let's come back and move on a wee bit. I think after Piaget, and the value in Piaget is he was the first to try and figure out the stages of development and to quantify the differences in each age level. 1958, Lawrence Kohlberg followed up the work of Piaget, and Kohlberg essentially does a critique of Piaget's different levels. And Kohlberg wrote what was called The Psychology of Moral Development, the nature and validity of the moral stages. And it's interesting that when we were having our wee discussion about how do you know when you're seeing spiritual development, one of the things we mentioned was that often we assess it by moral understanding. So does a young person habitually tell the truth? Do they exhibit integrity? Would you trust them? Kohlberg said that's all fine and well going through the differences between cognition and comprehension. But if you want to talk about spirituality, he said you really have to look at morality too. So he came up with the psychology of moral development. And let's have a look at this. He came up with 6 stages. And he looked at it in terms of how does a child develop morally. So he said there's a first stage called the obedience and punishment orientation. And it's the how can I avoid punishment? And you see that with kids. You can understand where he's coming from with this. Obedience and punishment orientation. How can I avoid a negative consequence for my actions? Second stage is what he called self-interest orientation, the idea of individualism and exchange. Morality is seen in terms of simple deals. So what's in it for me? How do I get a benefit? How do I get the prize? Third stage, interpersonal accord and conformity. Morality is dependent on good interpersonal relationships. Peer pressures play a huge role, and social norms start to form. That idea of the good boy and the good girl attitude. I see it in primary schools. You watch a class come into the assembly hall, and they all sit down on the floor, and there's always one that folds their arms, legs in a basket, index finger on the lips. And that's the one who's doing the good boy, good girl routine. Morality is dependent on good interpersonal relationships, peer pressures. Then there's the fourth stage, authority and social order maintaining orientation. It's that stage that kids go through. That's not fair, that's not right, where they're working out what's acceptable. And that comes partly with the peer pressures as well. Social contract orientation. This is where Kohlberg said older kids and teenagers begin to think about what makes for a good, functioning, and safe society. And then the final stage, he reckoned, was the formation of a principled conscience, what he called universal ethical principles. And he said some people never reach this stage. Now, what's interesting about Kohlberg's is, have you noticed he's just removed all age references here? So this is not age banded. This is about different stages. It's another way to think about development. And I think it's quite handy. He mentions peer pressure there. So let's have another wee talk about here. If you're looking to spiritual development, the kids in your school, in your class, in your youth group, can you play into that peer pressure? Can you help the group to form its thinking? Which matters more? Is it the individual mentoring and discipling, the one-to-one stuff, or is it group work? What has the biggest spiritual impact? Sometimes it comes down to what you're most comfortable with yourself.
Steve,
I
that's,
think-
oh, sorry, I'm going.
Go ahead, Craig.
I do my life courses in the high schools, and what I notice is group work seems to develop people more, but I tend to go needs led, you know, and I recognise the group I've got and I focus on specific issues or anything that a pupil's got, but I tend to focus on the whole group. But I do feel the group work is more successful, you know, when you've got a group setting, but it's getting the right group together. And we tend to get the teachers to pick the right group. It's going to settle with each other, you know, because having the wrong group can rub people up the wrong way and stuff. But I do think that group work tends to work a lot better, you know, in that setting.
Can I pin you down to that word you used, successful? Group work is more successful. Successful at what?
Successful in helping each other gain knowledge and bounce off each other, so to speak. I would say successful as in to learn a bit better and to retain a bit more knowledge, you know.
Yeah.
It's just,
So is that feeding into the cognition or the comprehension side? This is why it's useful to go through all these different ways of thinking and just then to reflect on your own practice. Thanks for starting us off there, Craig. Anybody else? What do you think is best for spiritual development and well-being? Is it the one-to-one mentoring?
I think one of the things that Craig said, it's dependent on need. So dependent on the need, whether it be the needs of the individual, an individual within that group that would need discipleship, or you have to be, I think, within that kind of environment, able to read a situation, know, is this working for each individual within that group? And sometimes it is a fruitful time if within the group you can get them to work together, but sometimes there's individuals that will become evident that actually they need a bit more one-to-one mentoring.
You're speaking like a teacher there, drilled
Sorry.
in Gurfek.
Sorry.
No, I think it's useful to hear that perspective, because certainly within a professional setup in schools, it's drilled into you, Gurfek, getting it right for every child.
Yeah.
And you're quite right to identify that for us. It depends on the needs of each individual child. Some will flourish in a group. Others are going to need that deeper one-to-one.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. You'll find a copy of Gurfek on Aula when you get there as well. But Gurfek, getting it right for every child, you could go to the Education Scotland website and download that. It's a major piece within schools about, it's what leads on to individual learning plans and so on. And this determination, you've got to get it right for every child. Anybody else want to make a comment? Are you happy to move on? Let's move on. Let's talk about the next key figure. When I was going through university in the 1960s, this was the key character in terms of work in theology with children. It was the work of Ronald Goldman. In 1963, he produced a book called Readiness for Religion. And he was writing in the 1960s when there was a real time of discussion about the place of religion in schools. And you can see it in the language that's used in schools. So when I was going through school in the 1950s and 60s, you talked about religious education. Everybody did religious education. And that changed, because what we did was actually called religious instruction. In the 1960s, it changed title to religious education. And it became about comparative religion. Now, Goldman is writing in that context, where in the 1960s as well, secularists are beginning to challenge the privileged place of religion in our schools. They're beginning to ask, why do you make kids sing from a hymn book? Why do you have a minister come in and lead in a prayer? What's this all about? So Goldman came up with his book, Readiness for Religion. And I think the key thing for me about Goldman's work is that he talks about development by mental age rather than by chronological age. If you remember, that was the approach that Piaget had taken. It was very much about specific age bands. Goldman talked about understanding, comprehension. And yet he then falls into the trap of being very specific. So from 0 to 9 years and 7 months is what he called the mental age. It's the uncritical and unquestioning literalism is the norm. So prayer is seen in terms of magic. The Bible is accepted as being a book by God because older people say it is. And there's a real physical anthropomorphism applies to God. To a certain extent, you still see that in schools. Occasionally I do an exercise with primary 6 and 7 where we talk about their views of God. What do they think God is like? And given the option to draw what they think God is like, invariably you get a picture of a bearded man sitting on a cloud. And you ask them, where'd you get that idea from? And it's this crude physical anthropomorphism. God's this older character sitting on a cloud surrounded by angels with harps. There's a second stage of mental age from, and again, he was quite specific, from 9 years and 7 months to 12 years and 7 months old, is where insight develops and there's a more critical way of thinking. So prayer is seen as semi-magical, the Bible is special, not because older people tell you it is, but because of its particular physical characteristics, its language, its size, its colour, its print. There's a more realistic insight to the nature and function of the church. Up till then, there's no real awareness of the nature of the Bible until well into secondary school. And even here, a literalism lingers. Church begins to be seen as a help in moral behaviour, a help in achieving peace or confidence. It's interesting that he does go for that age 9 through to 12, because I think that is an age when a lot of churches lose their contact with kids. If you think about the kids going through your Sunday clubs, your Sunday schools, they get to that last year, P7, S1, and that's when we lose quite a lot of them. Goldman would say it's about readiness for religion. Very specifically, he says there's a crisis point, age 12 and 7 months to 11 months is the end of that basic literal stage. Prayer is non-magical, seen in terms of conviction and faith. The Bible is accepted as true because it's rooted in historical fact, it's true to experience. That's what Goldman called a relevance for today. So there's a critical point where you could lose kids, or it could be the point where they actually engage more in terms of comprehension. And then from 15 onwards, that mental age, he talks about a fully critical stage in relation to the Bible. Concepts of inspiration in relation to the Bible are accepted and understood. It's the stage of really questioning. In a sense, Goldman goes back to specific ages, but he's beginning, I think, to get across that point that moral development, spiritual development is not linear. It's about not just a physical age, but it's about a mental age or an age of understanding. So we'll carry on at the moment, but just to think about the children and young people you work with, what would be the best Bible stories to explore with them? You know, if you are working with primary school kids, what would be the best story? If you're engaging with secondary school kids, what would be the best Bible stories to explore with them? We've reached roughly halfway, so I'm going to suggest that we stop there for a 5-minute break. I need to top up my caffeine. And that gives you an opportunity in those 5 minutes to have a wee think about that. The age group of the kids you're actually working with most. What would be the best Bible story and why? But I'll pause the recording. So far, we've looked at Piaget, Kohlberg, and Goldman, who are the early thinkers on spiritual and moral development. And it's been useful to see what the markers they're looking for. But I think you'll have noticed they're quite age specific. And they do identify the key age as being about 11 or 12. Which is interesting if you bear in mind this familiar section from Luke's Gospel. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. The age is significant. It's exactly the age that seems to be critical in all those views we've looked at so far. It's also critical within Jewish culture. It's the age of bar mitzvah. Now, it's not mentioned that that was part of the reason they'd gone up that year. But I think we can make an assumption that as a good Jewish family, it would have been part of what was happening. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. And after the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. And you know how it follows that they thought he was in their company. They traveled a full day before realizing he wasn't there. And they go back to Jerusalem and they hunt for him for 3 days. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. If we were to apply the questions we've been asking in this last hour to that particular episode and to Jesus, what would we say? There's a cognition, there's a comprehension issue going on there. There's a questioning that's going on. He is that pupil who's just pushing the limits and wants to know more. It's quite a fascinating wee episode. We've looked at, as I say, Piaget, Kohlberg, and Goldman. I want to look at another wee group of 3 further thinkers. And they begin to talk about stages of faith. So let me introduce them to you. Okay, you should have that on screen now. Some of these names you might have heard of, you might even have these books. And the first one I want to deal with is John Westerhoff. He's continuing to revise his work. Excuse me. His initial book was 1976, but there's a third revised edition came out in 2012. And Westerhoff talks not so much about stages of faith or particular ages, not so much about comprehension, cognition, but I find this quite useful. He talks about styles of faith. So one person may progress from one style to another at a very different rate to another person. Excuse me. Sometimes the movement through the styles is reversed. Any style may be omitted. A person might jump to the next state. He pictures these styles a bit like the rings of a tree growing outwards. And that's, I think, helpful. The idea that faith is a living thing. And in our discussion, we mentioned that spiritual development is not linear. And I think one of you said that it can go backwards. Sometimes you miss a stage. Excuse me now. Westerhoff recognized that, and he talks about stages of faith. So he talks, first of all, about experienced faith, faith that's received from those who nurture us, molds and influences our lives and the core of our faith during the impressionable stages of life. You can see that young kids quite often come out with a statement and you think, where did you get that from? And then you meet their parents and you know exactly where they got that view from. It's not just faith, it's values, it's behavior patterns. A lot of that we get from really early on. I do remember reading a psychology paper that said actually most people's core values are already formed by the age of 2, which is quite astonishing. And I think, unfortunately, could be true. Experienced faith. So you can think probably of church families who've really brought their kids up in faith. That's the first stage of faith. It's experienced faith. What our faith is from what we experienced from people around us, the ones who nurture us. Then there's what Westerhoff called affiliative faith. And this is the peer pressure thing, the peer molding, where we begin to assume the characteristics and values of a group who support us. We might begin to identify with a particular faith. And I don't know about you, but I always reckon if you're doing youth work in a church context, the hardest kids to win is always the first one. Because once you've got one, they are the best evangelists. They'll bring their friends. They'll bring the folks that are the similar interests to them. That peer pattern is incredibly important, which is why we were thinking earlier on about what's going to be best for faith development, spiritual development. Is it the group context or is it the one-to-one? Westerhoff, I think, says it's both and that kids will swap between these. It's not a linear process. He then talks about a third stage, searching faith, where we begin to question it and experiment with different religious interpretations. We recognize that our faith has been formed by others rather than by our own personal beliefs. Fourth stage is what he calls owned faith, what you might call a conversion experience, in which we assume the responsibility for our own beliefs and practices. It's that point that a lot of youth workers are pushing towards when a child says, I have accepted Jesus as my Saviour and Sovereign. That moment of conversion, faith. Westerhoff calls that an owned faith, when it becomes a person's own faith. In the second edition of the book, 1980, he revised his description of these stages and kind of cuts it down to affiliative faith, searching faith, and then he used the title mature faith. I'm going to give you a chance just to split into wee groups here. I'm going to put you in pairs. Let's take advantage of the benefits of Zoom. And for the next 5 minutes, I want you to think about an individual child or young person that you know who is searching for faith. Okay? So in 5 minutes, you're going to have to be quite tight on time. But I want you to give the first name or a pseudonym, just a quick biography, brief bio of that child or young person who you identify as searching for faith. You might want to think about the Westerhoff thing. What stage of faith are they at? Is it experienced faith, or are they at the cusp of thinking things through for themselves? So I will stop share. Is anybody uncomfortable with doing this, being in a pair? I can make 2 groups of 3 instead, if that's easier. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, I'm going to put you in pairs. So if you've used breakout rooms on Zoom, you'll know how this works. You'll get an invitation to join a group and you have to actively do that. If you really can't face doing that, that's okay, just let me know. And I'm just going to use the random setting here. Welcome back, everyone. Those 5 minutes in a breakout room always go so quickly. But hopefully it's given you a chance just to anchor what we're learning in your actual experiences and to get you thinking about where this applies to the kids you actually know, or the school that you work in, or the youth group that you work with. Well, we've had a look at Westerhoff's styles of faith. I'm going to introduce you to the next character. And he talks more specifically about stages of faith, and that's James Fowler. James Fowler is working around about the same time period as John Westerhoff, although, as I say, Westerhoff is still going strong, still updating his work. James Fowler wrote a key book, 1981, called Stages of Faith, The Psychology of Human Development and the Quest for Meaning. And it is quite an academic text, but it certainly repays close reading. In some ways, he goes back to Piaget and reassesses it. So he looks at what he calls stage 0, which is birth to 2 years. And he talks about primal or undifferentiated faith. I recommend you get the book and you can plow through that bit. It gets more interesting as he goes through the age groups. So stage 1 is what he reckons from the age 3 to 7, and you'll recognize that sounds quite similar to where Piaget was going. He talks about intuitive projective faith. And here's where the academic language comes in, characterized by the psyche's unprotected exposure to the unconscious. What on earth does that mean? Well, there's your doctorate. You can have a wee go at figuring that one out. It's the whole idea of what we could sum up as saying a God consciousness, even when we don't know that that's what it is. You might well have heard it put this way, that inside everybody there's a God-shaped hole. And hopefully, if somebody is connected to a church or has a live relationship with a Christian, you can help them identify who this God is. You can give them the right fit for that God-shaped hole inside of them. If there's not a Christian around somebody, then people will fill that gap with anything and everything, or they might explore other faiths. That idea of the God-shaped hole inside each person is really what this language is talking about. That from the age of 3 to 7, there begins to become a consciousness of other realms, other possibilities. The psyche's unprotected exposure to the unconscious. It's often actually when kids have spiritual experiences but don't know what it is they're seeing or having. I come across 3 to 7-year-olds who tell me quite cheerfully that an angel came to visit them last night. Okay, don't put that down. Explore that with them. Help them to understand what's going on. Stage 2 is what Fowler called the mythic literal faith, strong belief in the justice and reciprocity of the universe. The deities are almost always anthropomorphic. If you're a Marvel fan, if you watch these films, you'll recognize what this is all about. They're really aimed at this mythical, literal stage. Stage 3, he says, arises in adolescence. So he begins to step away from Piaget's very strict age bands. He talks about a synthetic conventional faith characterized by conformity, peer pressure kicking in. But what's interesting is about Fowler is that he then takes this beyond childhood. And I think this is really useful because, yep, we work with kids maybe up to 17, 18 in a secondary school setting, or if you're a university or college chaplain, you might have them to their early 20s. But this is quite useful. Fowler makes the point that the early learning on faith shapes the rest of life. So he talks about stage 4, mid-20s to late 30s, what he called the individuative reflective faith, the stage of angst and struggle. It's where an individual has beliefs and then that's tested in the workplace or in a relationship or a relationship breakdown. It's tested in real life. And he then talks about stage 5 and stage 6. So stage 5 is what he calls the midlife crisis. Quite a thought that when you're working with kids, if you remember way back at the beginning, we read from Psalm 78, and that idea that following God's command to tell this generation about the glorious deeds of the Lord means you're impacting not just that generation, but the generation to come and the next generation. And I think Fowler picks up on that idea that what we're doing with children and young people could have an impact far later. So he talks about midlife crisis. Faith acknowledges paradox and transcendence, the reality behind the symbols of inherited systems. I've been in the pastorate here at Blantyre for 36 years and actually recognise this. I recognise kids that I first met in primary school nearly 40 years ago. And I'm re-encountering them as 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, who've now got their own families, and they're coming back to faith. They've lost faith, they've been out in the desert, but there's some midlife crisis that brings them back. And curiously, they remember me. I don't think because I'm anything special. It's just if you are that key person who helps somebody gain spiritual insight, that will be remembered. And the seeds that you sow early on, it may be decades before it comes back. But I find that quite a lovely thought, and it's, I think, one of the benefits of a long-term ministry. You begin to pick up the midlife crisis. Stage 6 is what Fowler called universalizing of faith, what some might call enlightenment. And he's a bit cynical here. He says it's rarely encountered. Okay. Just raises a question. When have we done enough? When have we done enough to get a faith story across, a knowledge of Scripture? When have we done enough that when a person hits the midlife crisis, they'll recall what we've done and they'll come back to faith? When have we done enough? I think you must come across this, that you work with kids, maybe in primary school, and then age 11, 12, they're off to secondary school and you lose contact with them. Or you work with them in secondary school, 16, 17, they head off to college, you lose contact with them. And you wonder, have I done enough? And partly it's a guilt trip that we put on ourselves, I think. But have we done enough? When have we done enough? And do we trust the Holy Spirit to take what we've done and bring the fruit from it? The next character, and we're almost through them all, so well done for sticking with me. The next character I want to look at is Robert Coles, an American psychologist who essentially, he had that experience where one night he was tucking his daughter into bed and she said, "An angel came to visit me last night." As a psychologist, he decided to explore that with her. "Tell me about that," he said. "What was the angel like? What did the angel say?" Rather than acting as a parent saying, "Well, that's nonsense, such things don't happen," or dismissing it, or saying, "That's nice, dear," he started to explore that with her. And that started a process that when he was working with children and young people, he would ask them about their spiritual experiences. Now, at the time, Robert Coles was not a Christian. He wasn't himself a man of faith. He was purely and simply a psychologist. He became fascinated with the number of times children and young people were describing spiritual experiences, encounters with angels, sensing God with them, hearing God speak to them. And he ended up writing this book on the spiritual life of children. It's thoroughly well researched. I just want to highlight one quote from it. I think this is a key point that he makes. Consideration of God, connection with God, experiences of God, thinking about God, and about the nature of God can occur at any age, and perhaps never more so than when we are children. I just love that quote. Consideration of God, connection with God, experiences of God, thinking about God, about the nature of God can occur at any age, perhaps never more so than when we're children. Let's take advantage again of Zoom. This time we'll use the chat function. Do you all know how that works? You should find at the bottom of your screen or at the top of the screen, whatever device you're using, there's a wee option called chat. And if you can click on that, a little bar should open at the side. And you'll see it has message TfR class. So what you type in there, we can all see. What I want you to type in there is simply this. What is your earliest spiritual experience? I'm not going to try and define that or quantify it, but can you write a wee line? What is your earliest spiritual experience that you can remember? There's no right or wrong answer. Thanks, everybody. You're not obliged to put anything into the chat there, but that's fascinating just to see the range of experiences there. Does anybody want to expand on what they've written? I still love it when I hear a skylark. Unfortunately, the numbers have crashed over the years. What used to be quite a common experience, watching skylarks rise up, it's become very rare.
I am now reassured of the verse, and I think it's in Jeremiah, that speaks of God will command his angels to protect you.
Yeah.
And as I say, I would have been about 6 when my grandmother died, and our whole lives changed because of it. We moved 600 miles to my father's hometown, and there was a lot going on. But I was terrified, absolutely terrified of them, both my parents dying. And that kind of thought of angels being in existence. And I'd been taken to church as a very young child, but angels weren't really in the mix of what was talked about. It was a Roman Catholic church that my parents had taken me to. So it was very God and saints and Jesus, but actually not, angels weren't talked about apart from at Christmas. But now, as an adult, knowing that this verse sits in existence in God's word just kind of goes, yep, and they're still doing it. Yeah. So
Sorry, I was still muted there and chuntering away. Yes, thank you for sharing that, Fiona. And just to affirm for you what Robert Coles says, that actually it's very common for 6, 7, 8-year-olds to have religious experiences, spiritual experiences, encounters with God, with angels, and so on. But it's so very rarely spoken about. And often when kids try to tell their parents about it, it's dismissed. It's not understood. And yet it is an incredibly common thing. I think it reinforces what James Fuller was saying and Westhoff about the God-shaped hole inside of people. Anybody else want to just highlight what they were writing there? Ian, do you mind if I ask you about the answers to prayer, ages 10 and 11?
Yeah, sure. It was just quite. I guess it was the first time that I remember really seeing something, because it was just it was a very direct and immediate thing. That was out with my friends, and there was a group of bullies that we knew, and they were heading our way, and I just started praying for them to like turn around, and inexplicably they turned around and just walked away.
Yeah.
So that was, I guess, because it was so direct and so immediate. That was just, well, there's no other, like, what far too big a coincidence.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That was just a simple thing. Actually, you saying about these kind of profound experiences, that like I have some vague memory of some kind of dream of Jesus, and I kind of have forgotten about it. And it's just as you kind of saying about it, that I do seem to find something, and I guess it was pretty vague at the time, but I think I do remember how there being a dream, me being able to remember some kind of something. But again, I can't really remember any details about it, but I remember it feeling profound.
Thank you.
And that was really young. I can't really remember it. It's always just going to be a bit of a vague memory that I could never really hold on to. But
yeah, would you have called yourself a Christian at that point?
Yes,
Uh-huh.
yes. I guess I was still pretty young, and it wasn't really until my teens that I would really say that I owned my faith.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would have. Yeah.
Interesting that you use the word owned.
Yeah, well,
Well,
I'm just saying
talks
that it's a good way to to understand it. Yeah.
You can see the styles of faith, the stages of faith, that point where it becomes owned.
Yeah.
And the experience was already there before you actually.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And Fiona, yes, stories of angels and encounters with Jesus amongst children are incredibly common. And I don't think we encourage them and embolden them to explore these. It's a very common way, too, for Muslims to come to faith. I don't know if you've ever read any stories of people who come from Muslim backgrounds, come to faith. Quite often, there's a reference to a nighttime visit from Jesus or a dream visit from Jesus. And that's what enables them to actually come to faith. Okay, we've got two more characters to look at. Let me just close down the chat so I can see you all a bit better now. And I'll go back to the screen share. I think it's a really helpful quote from Coles where he talks about this consideration of God, connection with God, and so on, can occur at any age, and perhaps never more so than when we are children. And if we're looking for spiritual development, I think we need to be alert to these moments when children and young people are experiencing something of God. Two more characters that I want to tell you about just briefly. The first is Rachel Kessler, an American church worker. She's passed away now. But Rachel wrote Gateways to the Soul in Education. And she was writing, of course, in the American setting where there is a separation of church and state and a separation of religion and schools. And you've probably heard stories coming across from over the pond of schools that ban prayer or how difficult it is for Christians to operate in schools. There are a huge number of faith-based schools in the United States, and that's to get around that issue. But within the public school setting, it's very difficult to talk about spirituality. So Rachel Kessler was working in that setting. And she speaks about gateways to the soul in education and building on the work of Robert Coles. What she says is there's a God-seeking instinct that's built into each of us. And she spoke about yearnings, longings, and urgings. And she was working particularly with late teens. So it was 15 to 17, 18-year-olds who were just about to go on to college. And she realized, working with them as a secondary school teacher, that when she got to know them and formed a relationship with them, when they began to trust her, they would tell her about their lives. They would tell her their stories of spirituality. And she came up with these 7 things that she felt were actually really common amongst all late teens. She said they have a yearning for deep connection. And it could be deep connection with another human being or with a spiritual reality. They have a longing for silence and solitude. My goodness, kids these days are submitted to so much noise, aren't they? And I think a lot of our kids have lost the value of silence and solitude. When do they have moments for quiet reflection? You might have heard of Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh is a Buddhist priest who was asked by a school in America to give advice. They said, our school is chaotic, the behavior is terrible. Have you any ideas for what we could do? And Thich Nhat Hanh said, start the day with 5 minutes of silence across the whole school. And all the teaching staff went, what earthly difference will that make? But they decided to try it. So as kids came in for school, They would have the usual, take the register and so on, notices, but then across the whole school, there was a buzzer sounded, and for 5 minutes, all they had to do was sit in silence. And at first it was incredibly difficult, but the whole school and every person in it began to look forward to it, and they called it the most precious time. They voluntarily switched off phones, they put their electronic devices away, and kids really valued 5 minutes of quietness and peace. And it meant that when they went to their first classes, it was in a quiet mood, quiet atmosphere. Wonder how that would work in a Scottish school. I think the third thing Kessler picks out is that late teens have a search for meaning and purpose. It's the point where they ask the classic questions: why am I here? What's the point of life? It's when they ask the big questions. And there's fewer and fewer places in our curriculum where they can do that. Used to be you could do it in religious and moral education, but even there, I think it's being squeezed out. Simple questions like, is there a God? What is God like? What is the meaning of this world? Where did this world come from? The big questions of meaning and purpose. She said the kids also wanted moments of joy and delight. They wanted the opportunity for creativity. Schools are all about curriculum, about tests. Sometimes it feels like a factory. You're pushing through kids through all these different assessments, and that creativity gets left out. I find it disappointing to see how many Scottish schools, for example, are beginning to drop music lessons, or they squeeze out art classes. But that creativity is an urge that young people have, and the urge for transcendence and the need for initiation. So Kessler, in her school, set up an end of year, end of term, end of school event where she targeted these 7 things. And it became not just about a graduation, but an opportunity for the kids to showcase their creativity, to express their joy and delight, and to do it in any way they wanted. And given that freedom, it turned into something the whole school began to look forward to. So Rachel Kessler's another really key character. Within the UK setting, you might have come across these 2 characters, David Hay and Rebecca Nye, who have worked for years with children and young people in English schools in particular, looking at this whole idea of the God-shaped hole and of the yearning that pupils have. And they wrote their book, Spirit of the Child. If you ever get the chance to hear either of them speak, take it. Get there as fast as you can. It's superb stuff. And they're continuing their work. So 2006 is the latest edition of The Spirit of the Child. They talk about categories of spiritual sensitivity, which goes back to what we were sharing in the chat function. What's your earliest experience of spirituality? Without trying to define it or categorize it, what's your earliest experience? Interesting, we could all put something down there. And it was even sparking memories of things we'd forgotten. Now, Hay and Nye talk about this yearning, the urge that Kessler identified, and they said it's the same in the UK. Whether you're in the United States or the UK, children and young people have a spiritual sensitivity, and that's universal. Now, their work is being replicated in Singapore, in India, and so on. So I think it's a genuine point that they make, that all people growing up do have an innate spiritual sensitivity, and that really needs to be nurtured. It's a universal trait. It's that God-shaped hole everyone has. So this is what they came up with. They said that everybody has an awareness sensing. And they use the word sensing. And I always puzzle, is it a noun or a verb? and they talk about sensing. I think it's both. They talk about everybody has an awareness sensing. So we begin to develop an awareness of where we are in the here and now. And we talk about tuning, flow, focus, and so on. And you can identify it maybe in yourselves when you're engaged in a task, everything just flows, time disappears. When you don't want to be engaged in a task, there's no flow. Awareness sensing, mystery sensing, wonder and awe and imagination, value sensing, ultimate goodness and meaning. If you remember, it was right at the end of what we were doing last week, but we mentioned the 6 sensings in the curriculum for excellence. And you'll recognize values, mystery, and awe. It's there it comes from the work of Hay and Nye. We've reached the end. I can close down a few windows here now and I can see you all better. That's given you a kind of a whistle-stop tour on the whole idea of spiritual development, how you assess it, how you recognize it. And hopefully it's got you starting to think about this in terms of the kids you actually work with. So we've got 5 minutes left. I just want to see if there's any questions or comments, any observations about what we've done today. I'll stop the recording.